So in the first section, this whole prolegomena section we just went through, what we did was an eagle-eye view of this massive territory known both as the Christian faith and in the context of larger issues about religion in general. And what I did was I used a historical approach to show that there is a major distinction to be made in early Christianity between Paul and the Jerusalem church. And then we worked that around through the hermeneutic of the lens of mimetic theory to demonstrate that the issues that the mimetic theory observes are all there in play in early Christianity. Now, one of the things we're going to do tonight is begin. If we did a view from 30,000 feet, we're dropping down to about 15,000 feet tonight, and for the next whole section on Christology, because what we really have to do is we absolutely have to change the trajectory of the discipline. And the only way to change the trajectory of the discipline is to reframe the way we understand this thing called Holy Scripture. That's just absolutely essential in my opinion. So you'll remember the very first lecture back in May when I talked about starting points, and I offered about a dozen different starting points in systematic theology and showed you the different authors and where they started and why starting points are important. And you may recall from that the very first starting point that I started with when it came to a systematic theological approach to this business of Christian doctrine was with Jeffrey Wainwright and his book Doxology. Now, I didn't put that one first on mistake, because what we're going to do is we're going to use this approach and ask a question about Christology that is usually only asked in the academy. And so if we look at what we're framing out here for the next several weeks, what we have is we're going to start with Christology and the liturgical practice of the early church, because really what we want to know is, who is this Jesus that they think they're worshiping? But we're going to have to put boundaries on this church or community. And so next week, we're going to talk about discipleship. After we talk about discipleship, then and only then can we actually talk about the community. And then finally, we're going to look at Christology as traditioned experience. That is, how these various communities are forming their understanding of Jesus within around, you've got to think now, around the Mediterranean, okay, the major centers around the Mediterranean, from Jerusalem to Alexandria, on over to North Africa, what is now Libya. Early Libyan Christianity, by the way, is a real kind of a cutting edge. There's a lot of stuff that's coming out about early Libyan Christianity. There's an institute devoted to it now. Then we'll move up, you go around the Mediterranean, you have Rome, you come around to Corinth and Athens, on over to Ephesus, and so on and so forth. So these communities are going to be developing Christologies, understandings of Jesus. And some of these Christologies are going to end up being textualized, either in letters or in these things that are called gospels, which is a slightly new literary genre. Again, there's a lot of debate about the relationship between the gospels and ancient biographies and ancient histories, but we're not getting into any of that tonight. That's down the road a pace. For tonight, I want to focus the question in a little more sharply. I want to observe, coming back to our use of Bauer's thesis about the division in early Christianity between Paul and the Jerusalem church. I don't know if you've ever done this as a thought experiment before, but when you look at the early church, on the assumption Jesus dies in the year 33, and that's probably the best and most accurate assumption. The Apostle Paul, if Jesus dies in April, what we know as April of 1933, of the year 33, it is only going to be 18 months later, in October of 34, that an absolutely crazed zealot that hates these early Jewish Christians will be knocked off his horse. And that's, of course, the Apostle Paul. 18 months. I want you to think about this for just a second, because chapters 1 through 9 of the book of Acts are all we have of the first 18 months. And then chapters 10 through 28, the next 18 chapters, take place over the course of the next 30 to 35 years. I want you to think about how little information we actually possess, even from the one book that is trying to be a history. Are you with me so far? Okay. And I want you to notice when you come to those first 9 chapters of the book of Acts, what is it that you really see? Well, what you really see initially is this community of Galileans. Excuse me, I'm letting Devin in. You see this community of Galileans now leading a larger group that meets both somewhere, whether it's this upper room, and eventually they will meet together on Pentecost Day in the temple. And that group is the more than 500 brethren, where Jesus appears. Jesus appears to them. There's a use of the verb orao in the Acts 2 text, which is only ever used of the risen Jesus. And it's in that text that this manifestation of the Spirit is seen. And so it appears that Pentecost is the revelation of the risen Christ to the more than 500 brethren that Paul talks about. And it would be important that that takes place prior to Paul's conversion, because in the list in 1 Corinthians 15, where he lists off the witnesses to the resurrection, of course, omitting all the women, it's just James and Peter and all the apostles, and then the 500 brethren, and then himself. You need to begin asking fundamental questions about these 500 brethren that are meeting together in the temple on Pentecost, because they come from everywhere under the sun, and they are actually part of 2 distinct Christian communities in Jerusalem. These 2 distinct Christian communities are going to be those that do their prayers and their synagogue in Aramaic, and there are going to be those from around the diaspora living that have come to either visit or can afford to own a vacation home in Jerusalem, as it were, and who are going to attend the Greek-speaking synagogue. And it is this simple linguistic split that is going to also produce the rift in the early church that we see already in Acts chapter 6. Let's say that we were to do a strict ratio division of chapters 1 through 9 into 18 months. Chapter 6 would come in at 12 months. Already within a year, this community is no longer happy clappy, sitting at the apostles' feet, breaking bread, going from house to house. They're not doing that anymore. There's already in chapter 6 such serious, significant issues. And these issues are not just about bread, because within this community, there will be leadership. And the Jewish community, whose widows, they're Aramaic-speaking widows, they're being fed, but the widows of the Greek-speaking community, the Jewish, Christian, Greek-speaking community, their widows aren't being fed. Well, one of their the things that you can observe about this text is the names of each of these so-called leaders that are appointed, and we call them deacons, to take leadership of this Greek-speaking synagogal community that are Jesus followers. All of these names are non-Hebrew names, including one amongst them who will turn around and deliver a sermon in chapter 8 that is so anti-temple that it will get him killed with the pre-apostle Paul, as Saul at that point, consenting. And so chapter 8, which is Stephen's speech in the book of Acts, if we work backwards from that into chapter 6, we can already begin to see certain lines of thinking that are going to develop within Greek-speaking Christianity that are not going to be there in Aramaic-speaking Christianity. One of the things we can see is an absolute virtual rejection of the temple. Think about this. This is still, this is the year 34. It's only 18 months since the resurrection. And already some Christians, that is Greek-speaking diaspora Christians, who would have been attending the synagogue of the freedmen in Jerusalem, these Greek-speaking Christians had an understanding of what Jesus did that included a separation from the temple. And we can see this in the term that's used in Acts chapter 8 in Stephen's speech, where he refers to the temple as a, quote, house made of hands, unquote. And it's precisely that word, which in the Greek Septuagint, remember they're Greek speaking, so they're going to read the Septuagint. It's in the Septuagint that term is used in the prophets for all the temples that people make that they put their idols into. In other words, to call something a house made with hands is to call it a place of idolatry. Now, I just need you to hang on to this for a second, because if such is the case, if in fact we have a major theological difference in understanding the temple already within these two communities, it would also stand to reason we're going to have a different understanding of relationship to Torah as well in those two communities. The one thing that we know both from the book of Acts as well as certain apocryphal literature is that James, the brother of Jesus, and the Galileans continued temple worship. We also know that they were the ones behind requiring the Gentiles to do Torah observance with regard to circumcision, kosher food, and Sabbath keeping, the three marks of a Jew in the ancient world. Now, if within a year we can begin to see this split already, we're not waiting until 70 CE, we're not asking questions about were the gospel writers, did they mention the destruction of the temple or this and that and the other. We can already see that there are questions about the temple and whether the temple is an appropriate place to worship Jesus. Because for the early Christians, Jewish, Aramaic speaking and Greek speaking, for both of them, Jesus had been exalted to the right hand of the Father. One of the things that you can do with people that I love to fool around with, if I said to you, what's the most quoted text from the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament? Now, if you read the Jesus-driven life, I gave it away there. And if you read it and you don't remember, shame on you. But the most quoted text from the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament, quoted by almost every writer, is Psalm 110:1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. It is this exaltation of the man, Jesus, to the right hand of the Father that will end up becoming an early Christian hymn. And you know that hymn from Philippians 2, 5 through 11. We'll discuss that later. It's also part and parcel of what's known as an adoptionist Christology. The Father adopted the human Jesus and gave him the name above all names. That there is, that I should say that there are places that we'll see when we get to this next month, that there are places that it looks as though Jerusalem Christianity, that is the Galileans, and Jewish Christianity as it develops, and then of course it becomes Ebionism in the 2nd century, works from the premise that it is the man Jesus that is exalted and becomes God. Now there is, in the Greek-speaking church, a very, very different Christological approach. We see this in the Pauline letters and the Johannine literature. Paul uses the verb pempo, to send. The Father sent the Son into the world. That's Paul's fundamental starting point for Christology, is this sending of the Son. Whereas, again, for Jerusalem Christianity, the exaltation of the man Jesus is their fundamental starting point. But it is also in the Gospel of John that we can see that the sending of the Son is also essential. And of course, we have that lovely prologue at the beginning of John that has that phrase that just boggles every single person's mind: the Logos became flesh. So we have two ways of thinking right from the start. Now, I just want to generate a thesis that I use, and that's this. Stephen, the community around Stephen, is going to be not simply, when we say Jewish Christians, Greek-speaking Jewish Christians, we can be referring to diaspora Christians that have come from faraway places for a season of time in Jerusalem. We can also be speaking of upper class or aristocratic Jews who would have known Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. But we can also be speaking of Samaritans. One of the most interesting things about Stephen's speech are the number of connections that can be made to Samaritan thought. So much so that back in the late 60s, early 70s, a number of scholars connected the dots between Stephen's speech, Samaritan thinking, and the fourth gospel. And Oscar Kuhlmann did this in his book, The Johannine Circle. There is an appendix in the Anchor Bible Commentary by Abraham Spiro, and a number of other authors. It was that connection that intrigued me to go study Samaritanism. And what's really been fun is that back in the 80s, when I was trying to get my hands on anything related to Samaritanism, there weren't maybe 15, 20 books at best. But Samaritanism, since the turn of this millennium, has become a particularly rich field of discovery. And we certainly know a whole lot more about the Samaritans of the first century than we ever did before, just from the last 20 years of research. And so Samaritanism, from my mind, is really important. It's also really important because I think the suggestion that we can actually trace Gnosticism, which if you read the literature that the Boltzmannian school has put out about Gnosticism, they refer generically to Jewish elements and Christian elements in this Gnostic pattern, but they really can't nail it down. But if you follow at this point, the suggestions that Simon Magus, who's a Samaritan, and his follower Dositheus is the one that really brings together Judaism and this rather strange approach to Hellenistic philosophy. And so we can see how the early Jewish Christians who would have come out of the Samaritan tradition, maybe even the Dosithian part of that, could bring to bear on Christology fundamental issues that would create problems. That's part of what's going on in Stephen's speech. That's part of what's happening and the reason Paul has to exterminate Stephen and get rid of this movement. Let me ask you a very, very simple question. You are a Samaritan. You had your own temple until it was destroyed under John Hyrcanus after the Maccabean Revolution some 200 years prior. Are you going to follow a religious tradition that requires you to worship at the temple in Jerusalem? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And if the Aramaic-speaking Christian community required everyone to come to the temple, essentially what they're doing is they're saying, we whooped your ass 200 years ago, come and worship on the right mountain. And if Kuhlman is correct, and there is influence of Samaritan thinking in the fourth gospel, it makes sense that it's in the fourth gospel that we find the both anti-Mount Gerizim and anti-Mount Zion argument. Neither mountain is to be where God is to be worshipped. Worship of the Father takes place in spirit and in truth. So if we're going to frame this historically, what we have at the very, very beginning, in a nutshell, are two very different approaches, two very different scriptural traditions, the Targums and the Septuagint, two very, very different language systems, two very, very different, and I'm going to suggest behavioral approaches to this business of Jesus. So how indeed are we to understand this? How can we find a way into these communities, and how can we understand who it is they're worshiping? Did the Jerusalem church worship the same Jesus as the Hellenists did? Yes, they did. Did they see the role of the resurrection and ascension of Jesus differently? Yes, they did. For the one group, the resurrection of Jesus was the vindication of the tradition. For the other, it was the abrogation of it. For the Jewish-speaking Christian community, Torah was still valid. Temple was still valid. Kosher was still valid. Keeping Sabbath was still valid. Circumcision was still valid. Whereas, for the other community, that wasn't the case. But you have to ask this question. Did the other community, did the Hellenistic community, these Greek-speaking, brand new followers of the risen Christ, did they know the historical Jesus? Or are we limited to only the Aramaic-speaking followers of Jesus who traveled with him for at least 3 years, if the Johannine chronology is correct? I'm working with a hypothesis. It's something I've told you about this. I've been working on this for about 25 years now. That the Johannine community, which is basically Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and the friends around them, will end up with this Hellenistic Jewish community after the persecution, they will end up fleeing the country. And I think they will settle in Ephesus. And I think that's why we have a number of Mary graves in Ephesus in the tradition. And I also think it makes sense because Ephesus was a place that Jerusalem priests that were wealthy retired to. It was kind of like their Florida. And so there's a lot of former high priestly, hierarchical big shots there. And Eleazar, as it were, finds a place there. But no matter, what we have now are two fundamentally distinct approaches to Jesus. One by a community that knew him, one by a community where some may have known him, but the majority probably didn't. Which community does Paul fall under? Well, what's interesting is Paul straddles them both. That is, he's theologically oriented to the Jerusalem tradition of pro-temple, pro-Torah, because you'll notice that that community does not get persecuted. It is strictly the Greek-speaking Christians and their community that come under attack. And they come under attack because they're iconoclastic. And Paul would have shared with that community no knowledge of the historical Jesus. I find it interesting that the tradition on the front that it will develop from the influence of this early Greek-speaking community in Jerusalem will produce the major thinkers, the three thinkers of the New Testament, or writers, and I don't mean directly, it can be indirectly as well, but it's you can chase a trajectory out. There was a great book written in the late 70s by James Robinson and Helmut Kester on trajectories in the New Testament that was really very important for me and helped me to take this Bauer thesis even further. So if you take this trajectory of the anti-temple theme, you'll recall Paul replaces the temple with the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians. The Johannine author replaces the temple with the body of Christ in John 2. This he said of his body. Now, body would, if you're a fan of the Johannine author, you know that he uses words with double meanings. And so the question is, when he says this he said of his body, is he referring simply to the physical body of Jesus, the risen body? Or is he also referring to a larger body, a community? And then the third writer that comes out of that trajectory is Hebrews, the writer to the Hebrews. So in the early church, within this first year, there's already theological division. I think this suggests, number one, that the division between religion and revelation in the New Testament is already to be seen in the communities of the followers of Jesus. Number one. In other words, there was never at any point a happy, clappy, let's all get together and get along and we have one doctrine and we're just going to teach that one singular doctrine to everybody. We know that within 20 years, Paul will turn around and refer to that tradition of super apostles as servants of Satan. That's in the second letter to the Corinthians. However, having said all of this, the one interesting thing to me that in a sense runs counter to everything I've said here has to do with the fact that shot through the New Testament are verbal patterns that can be identified as liturgical fragments, pieces of hymnody that allow us inside, as it were, the early church to see who it was they worshiped. Now, if you ask yourself, where are the majority of these fragments to be found? They're found in the Pauline letters. There are hymns in the Pauline letters. Ephesians 1, chapter 3 to 14 is a hymn. It's also the longest sentence in the New Testament. But it's broken up into 3 verses, a Trinitarian structure, Father, Son, and Spirit, each followed by the repetitive chorus to the glory of God. Colossians 1, 15 through 20 is definitely a hymn. Walter Wink has an article showing that there is a late Gnostic treatise that in fact independently is using that same or a very similar hymn. And so Colossians 1, 15 through 20 is a hymn. Philippians 2, 5 through 11 is also a hymn. Who, being in the form of God, did not consider equality with God to consist in the act of grasping. You know the rest. Ernst Lohmeyer did a study and claimed to be able to retranslate the Greek of that text back into Aramaic, and which has led some scholars to think that the Aramaic speaking community produced this hymn. It's certainly possible, because at the end of it, after Jesus has died the cross death, you do have what appears to be an adoptionist Christology. Therefore, God highly exalted him and gave him a name above all names, etc., etc. The writer to the 4th gospel takes a hymn to wisdom logos and turns it into a prose preface. And you're familiar with the prologue of the Gospel of John. And if you strip out verses 6 through 9, and I believe it's verse 15, the references to the Baptist, and you put those verses together with verse 19, it forms a contiguous narrative, a good start to a narrative. And the hymn itself then has verses, but you mix them together, and which this author did in the chiastic structure that he used, and you now have the prologue. But in the Colossians hymn, in the Ephesians hymn, in the Philippians hymn, in the Johannine hymn, prologue, in any case, we have an entry from the top down, the Father sending the Son, who, being in the form of God, did not consider equality with God to be grasped, but became a human. We have that notion of incarnation is fundamental to the hymnody. That's the first thing to note. And you can find the same thing in the very little brief hymn in 1 Timothy 3:16. Okay, so this incarnational motif, the God has come into the world in Jesus. The Father sent the Son. All the language that's used at this point, that's what gets sung about. That's the starting point for their theological thinking and everything they're going to do. That is, the message is that God has done something. God has sent his Son. God has done something very specific. He has sent Jesus into the flesh to teach us who God is. And in each of these writers, Paul, the Johannine writer, and the writer to the Hebrews, there is a Jesus-Moses parallelism. In each case, Jesus, in one way or another, supersedes Moses. In one way or another. This is, again, I think, all the result of this early Greek-speaking Christian community that has already begun to see the implications of the gospel for the larger world. And that included Samaritans. I don't think the Samaritan question gets asked very much in the world of the academic study of the New Testament. People don't stop and say, what would it mean for Samaritans if they had to choose between the 12 and the Aramaic-speaking Christian community and the Greek-speaking Christian community? Which one would they choose? Who is it that ends up going to Samaria? It's Philip. All right. When we will look at these hymns, and by the way, do you know I have recordings online for the Ephesian hymn and the Johannine prologue? You can look those up. I've got hour-long expositions on both those online somewhere. Having said that, we're going to have to frame why the New Testament contains so much liturgy. And it's not just the Greek-speaking literature, it's the Jewish literature as well. For example, for a long time, at least now 100 years, going back to the 1920s and 30s, at least to the great work of E.G. Selwyn on 1 Peter. It's been recognized by many that 1 Peter is a baptismal sermon, or that at least incorporates within itself a baptismal sermon. The sacramentalism of the fourth gospel, the multiple references to blood and wine and bread and food. The Eucharistic references in the Synoptic Gospels with regard to the Last Supper and the Passion narrative and repeated in Paul. The fragments of hymnody, as well as liturgical fragments. For example, Paul will end the Corinthian letter with "Greet one another with a kiss of peace." That's a liturgical act. And of course, the writer to the Hebrews' entire theology is in and around liturgy, the liturgy that's done within the old covenant that is now being rethought and reframed in the light of Jesus. And then finally, even that one book of the New Testament that I would just as soon see is not there, the book of Revelation, is loaded with sacramental allusions and hymnody. And of course, the Gospel of Luke. The prologue to the Gospel of Luke contains a number of early Christian hymns. So the New Testament is suffused. It breathes the worship of the communities. It just breathes it. One thing I think is interesting is that the Jewish Christian literature, the literature that comes or is influenced by the Jerusalem church, does not appear, except for the book of Revelation, to include hymnody. And what's really even more intriguing to me is that the hymnody of the book of the Revelation is almost all a theology of glory. All praise and honor and majesty and everything be given to Jesus and the Father, because like they just beat the daylights out of everybody and they win, that kind of thing. You don't have any incarnational stuff going on in there in that hymnody, although you do have the references to the Passion with the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, but nothing before that. So I'm going to offer you some literature here, as I do for the things that have been influential to me as I'm developing this approach. The first is C.F.D. Moule, M-O-U-L-E, The Birth of the New Testament. I don't know if you can find a copy of this on Amazon. C.F.D. Moule. This book is worth its weight in gold. Moule was a Cambridge scholar, published, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s of last century. Brilliant exegete of texts. The second, of course, is Wainwright's Doxology. This is a theological approach. It's not an exegetical approach. Moles is an exegetical approach. Yes, what was the birthplace of the New Testament? It was the worship of the early church, created the literature, the thinking, and thus eventually the documents that would end up in the New Testament. The third is a book by an older book by Aidan Kavanaugh called On Liturgical Theology. This is for me an explosive book. I'll never ever forget reading it the first time. I'm just seeing where I bought it. This is a 1984 book. I would have read this early on in seminary. It's an explosive book because it comes out of the post-Vatican II tradition and is rethinking liturgy in light of the 60s. The 1960s produced a whole revolution in and around the city. Harvey Cox's Secular City, Paul Van Buren, all these thinkers were rethinking urban theology. And so this book also tackles that question. And as you know, if the Aramaic speaking Christians were from they were poor, they were Galileans. The Greek speaking Christians who obviously had money to travel, right? If indeed they're urbanites, the urban theology is going to be very different than rural theology. And think about this, it's especially the case in America today. Your urban churches are far more liberal. Your rural churches are far more conservative. And that's always been the case. It's the churches in the cities that have tended to produce the theology that really moves things forward. And it's the parishes in the countryside that tend to conserve the tradition. So one is forward-looking, one is backward-looking. This is just an offhand thing. I'm going to absolutely devastate Shane and Steve Crosby and any of you that are charismatics. I'm introducing you to Johannes Quasten. Johannes Quasten is a patrologist. It's his 4-volume patrology that is the standard out there, still is the standard. And this is titled Music and Worship in Pagan and Christian Antiquity. And it's the most thorough study done on the topic. The problem is, for you wonderful charismatics today, Quasten is able to show without a doubt that the early church rejected the use of instrumentation in worship. That kind of pisses me off too, because I happen to like instruments with music, and a lot of people can't carry a tune, but that'll devastate you. And then there is an awesome book by Joseph Jungmann, Jungmann. And Jungmann was the premier Roman Catholic liturgical historian of the 20th century. He has a 2-volume critical edition of the history of the Mass. But his early liturgy is a landmark book in seeking to see the development of these liturgical traditions for the first several hundred years. But the point is, there is this development. There are these trajectories. They can be seen. And they are oriented in a very, very clear pattern of one's relationship to this business of Torah, temple, and land, the pillars of ancient Judaism. For those of you that are interested in further study of the Acts of the Apostles, if you wanted to delve into this and you wanted to do some real serious work, I'm going to recommend, first of all, Ward Gask's History of the Criticism of the Acts of the Apostles. It's been updated. It has a new, you can pick this up online fairly cheap, $25. My edition's an older from back in the day. And I remember I took a class with Ward where I met him somehow, somewhere. I remember taking something because I've got it. He's signed it for me. This would have been before I left for seminary. It was weeks before I left. So I must have seen him and gone to see lectures or something. But this is his excellent study that examines the 19th and 20th century research in the history of Acts. And you'll recall one of the earlier lectures, I talked about the importance of what are called Forschungsgeschichten, that is the history of the discipline. What are the major players? What did they bring to the table? How were they critiquing each other? And where are we at today? What are the questions they resolved? What are the questions they left unresolved? What are the questions for us today? And on and on. There's nothing better on any topic than having a history of the research of that topic, because you get the broad view, and then you can do your deep dives. But I shouldn't want you to think that I only read the critical thinkers, because one of my favorite thinkers in New Testament studies, passed away in 2009, is a guy named Martin Hengel. And his little book, slim volume here on Acts and the history of earliest Christianity, a very, very important book. Over the years, I've felt freer to disagree with some of his positions, but it anchored me and showed me some of the real issues related to discussing the early church as a fragmented community. Ultimately, I think the argument for a united Christianity fails. I just don't think it exists. In other words, modern Christianity, modern ecumenism, this whole approach of why can't we all just get along? It was never there. There's no glorious Eden in the early church. There are just different communities asking, who is this Jesus we worship, and what's our relationship to Judaism? And it's asked first by Jews. And it's settled by Jews. You with me so far on that? All right. I will end the recording here. It's been long enough. Come on, where is stop?